Sacred harp music and the music of William Billings was never intended to be reintroduced to electric forms of music. The concept hadn't even been invented at the time. Despite this, sacred harp music translates well into chiptune sounds. But to truly understand the scope of why exactly it works and how it changes, it pays to first understand some basic history and capabilities that inform how chiptune music is created today. The very first computers to produce music used a series of non-sinusoidal waveforms that mostly included square waves, triangle waves, and noise waves. These were the easiest ways to create in a binary system. A square wave is either up or down, but never in between. A triangle wave is only ever increasing or decreasing, never flat. And noise waves were created by random intervals of up and down at the time. Moreover, computers cannot produce these sounds directly from their CPUs. That would be like speaking from your brain without your mouth. To create sounds, they needed two more things: a sound chip and a speaker. The sound chip would create waveforms to send to the speaker, and the speaker would process the waveforms, creating the distinct chiptune sound. There were many sound chips throughout the 1980s and 1990s, but the most common 8-bit chips were the Sega PSG, used in the Sega Master System and Sega Game Gear, the Atari TIA, used in the Atari 2600 and most other Atari units, and the Nintendo 2A03, used in the Famicom, NES, and Game Boy. The Nintendo 2A03, henceforth 2A03, held many more sound advantages than the Sega PSG, henceforth just PSG. The 2A03 contained 5 channels of voice, 2 pulse waves, which were modifiable square waves whose periods at the height, also called a duty cycle, could be customized for more sound control, a triangle wave, which could double as a drum synthesizer, a noise wave that had both white and brown noise, and a channel for pre-recorded audio called a DPCM. The PSG and TIA paled in comparison. Both only had 4 channels of voice, 3 square waves, and a noise wave, but these were the best sound chips at the time. For other, less popular sound chips, only had 3 voices of square waves and noise. In order to appeal to a younger, more male group of consumers, many video game music composers were also rock musicians, which is clearly evident in the simple chords and funky bass lines that were created for old consoles. Many of the old chiptune songs were later adapted for rock bands. In Japan during the 1980s, Sega began releasing versions of the Master System, the predecessor to the Sega Mega Drive, that ran with a Yamaha frequency modulation synthesis chip in addition to the PSG. The innovation of frequency modulation synthesis, albeit basic FM synthesis, carried over into the next generation of consoles across the board, and was a way to further diversify chiptune music. Around the same time, Nintendo released the Konami VRC7 add-on sound chip for the Famicom, which also included basic FM synthesis. It's about this point that the evolution of chiptune music from an application standpoint largely ends. By the late 1990s, consoles were being produced which could replicate real instruments with such accuracy that chiptune fell by the wayside. It couldn't compete with realistic rock guitars that used to be portrayed by square waves. That isn't to say that chiptune music stopped being produced, however. In his debut game, Undertale, Toby Fox primarily used a chiptune plugin with Flash Studio to create the soundtrack. As many people who played the game will tell you, the soundtrack was a huge success, pulling primarily from the 16-bit samples found in Earthbound, the sequel to the Mother franchise. Chiptune music today is used as a form of nostalgia for simpler times during the 1980s and early 1990s. There are a variety of platforms that chiptune music can be created with, but some are cheaper, more efficient, and better quality than others. In the time of the Sega Master System and Nintendo Entertainment System, chiptune music had to be entirely inputted by hand in binary code for the sound chip to read. This was time-consuming, tedious, and inconvenient. Chiptune music today, though, is most often associated with the Magical 8-bit plugin for Flash Studio, which Toby Fox has announced is how he makes all of his chiptune music. The Magical 8-bit plugin is very effective, but to pay $100 for a decent version of Flash Studio as a beginner is daunting, especially since Flash Studio is not designed to handle true chiptune music. There are many, arguably better, alternatives to the Magical 8-bit plugin on Flash Studio, however. The most common chiptune creators are called trackers, and they've existed since the late 1980s as a way to codify chiptune in order to avoid having to input all the notes by hand. In the early 1990s, Fast Tracker 2 became the most accessible tracker, being both relatively intuitive and very cheap. Today, trackers still emulate Fast Tracker 2 layout because of its accessibility and compatibility with actual hardware. Among these programs are Milky Tracker, Fami Tracker, and Deftly Mask. Both Milky Tracker and Fami Tracker are free. However, Fami Tracker was designed to replicate the Famicom specifically, in exemplum, all the consoles that Nintendo produced before the N64. Milky Tracker offers greater sample control and FM synthesis, although it's a little less intuitive for first-time users. Trackers have a few levels of composition: sample, instrument, channel, and pattern. At the sample level, a waveform is used as a sample of the sound, and when brought to the instrument level, that sound can change pitch, volume, and have all sorts of other effects. At the channel level, most effects come into play, and when channels are put together, it creates a pattern. When patterns are strung together, they create a full song. This method of composing music was so simple that it's still used today professionally. By recording samples instead of engineering them with FM synthesis, it is possible to create realistic sounding music with relatively simple music creators. This method of music creation was so simple that many music synthesizers use a similar sample instrument method to produce notes. For example, both MuseScore and Noteflight use this method. Essentially, they're just sheet music trackers. William Billings probably didn't anticipate having some of his music turned into chiptune, but his music fits many of the style requirements. Only a few voices, relatively simple rhythms, and loops that could theoretically go on infinitely. Although the stereotype for chip music has become fast-paced, action-packed rhythm, many fans remember it for the slow, impactful, and solemn songs. See also Earthbound's soundtrack. It is filled to the brim with absolutely amazing, slow, and impactful music. That isn't to say everything is perfect when transposing Billings' music for chiptune sounds. The biggest issue is transposing words into chiptune, but it is unfortunately impossible to turn square waves into comprehensible words without recording speech. Even if it were possible to record voice for all their parts, the machine wouldn't be able to play back at all because there would only be one channel where it could sound, the DPCM. The simplest way, and the way I took to get around the problem, is simply by omitting the words. A second problem is that there are only 3 channels of voice for the Famicom. On Milky Tracker, up to 32 voices of pitch can be added. I got around this problem by simply omitting the alto voice, which is usually the least important. The alto voice typically only harmonizes with either tenor or soprano voices. That left me with 3 voices because, for the most part, I used Fami Tracker, 2 pulse waves of varying duty, and a noise wave. I started using the 50% duty cycle pulse wave to represent the tenors because it sounds smoother at lower pitches. I used the 0% duty cycle for the sopranos because it sounds crisper at higher pitches, where the sopranos were playing. I reused the 0% duty cycle instrument for the bass line just to avoid any white noisiness in the bass. And with that, it was relatively simple to transpose. Trackers all work in the key of C, with all the accidentals of the Western keyboard, and I can read both treble and bass clef, and I have been for a couple of years. With full confidence, I can say I've succeeded in my goal that I set out for myself. I have learned significantly more about the inner workings of William Billings' music, as well as growing my own chiptune composition ability. I included a piece I composed in a similar style to Billings' music, but for chiptune sounds, titled Walltown. I'm immensely proud of what I accomplished, although I didn't stick to my schedule very well at all. Should I ever attempt a similar project again, I will actually stick to the schedule I will create.